In my last video, I went over some examples of references to Edward de Vere found encoded within the pages of the 1611 King James Bible. If you haven't seen it, please watch it and the other videos so that all this makes sense. Following the title, de Vere's number 1740 is found on the opening page. The words shake and spear are printed in the same book and chapter twice in the Bible. The abbreviation or anagram E. Vere is found connected to these words also by number. However, one time spear appears with not the word shake, but with the word shaking. In the book of Job, chapter 41, verse 29, counting from the top, the words shaking of a spear are printed on the 55th line. With Roman numerals, 5 is written as a V, so 5 is VV. I show another example of this in my 9th video, with Sonnet 55 being about de Vere's verse rather than statues making him immortal. Okay, there's a lot in verse 29. Again, it's on the 55th line, 5 or VV. The number 29 is turned up in previous codes because using Gematria, the letters EDV for Edward de Vere add up to 29. Now, reading the text, darts are counted as stubble. I found out that in sewing, darts are used to mark points. So what the text darts are counted is telling us is that all the characters printed here are to be counted. When we do that, there's 40 characters. Then we have the words shaking of a spear followed by a period or point, altogether 17 characters, giving us de Vere's number 1740. So 3 times in the Bible, shake or shaking and spear are connected to Edward de Vere. I also looked at the surrounding chapters 40 and 42 and found some other possible clues. First, chapter 42. With the repeated count, 42 is equal to 2 letter T's, or the double tau found in the Sonnets. The verse reference numbers are 1 and 16 equaling 17 and 7 and 10, also 17. Altogether equaling 34, which will come up again later. At the bottom, notice there's 17 verses and there's 12 words between the number 17 and the word 40. In previous videos, I explained how 12 is significant because there's 12 letters in the name Edward de Vere and Earl of Oxford. Turning back a page, there is chapter 40. If you count all the verse lines, including the verse references, the word man begins on the 40th line. In Latin, vir, vir is man. Notice also that it's 24 verses. Again, the letters for Edward de Vere and Earl of Oxford are 12 letters each, adding up to 24 letters total. On the second page of chapter 40, when we start counting, the words an ox begin as the 40th word. Technically, I know ox isn't the 40th word, but together with an, it's the phrase an ox that's the 40th word, which is an obvious allusion to Oxford. In the yellow triangle at the bottom, the words for thee forever can mean for T for E Vere, maybe. Having de Vere references in the book of Job makes sense because there's so much tragedy in it as there was in Oxford's life. So maybe there's some references in the book of Lamentations as well. It's 5 chapters long. Again, in Roman numerals, 5 is a V for Vere. It's 22 verses, and in Hebrew, tav or tal is the 22nd letter. Verse 17 begins on the 29th line. Again, 29 equals the letters EDV. Following the number 17 are the letters FORT, so 1740. Hebrew is read from right to left, so starting from verse 22, 22 being tau, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the words ever appear on the 7th and 10th lines, equaling 17. Again, ever is an anagram or an abbreviation for E. Vere, and the number of words between the two evers is 12, 12 for Edward de Vere and Earl of Oxford. Notice that ever appears in verses 19 and 20. With Gematria, 19 is equal to T, which is a cross or a Jesus reference, and 20 is equal to V, again for Vere. Next is the Gospel of John, chapter 19, where the tragedy of Christ crucified takes place. With Gematria, 19 equals the letter T or tau, and the chapter begins with the tau. It's 42 verses long. Again, 42 equals 2 T's, or the double tau in the Sonnets. Altogether, this might be an example of 4 T's or FORTIS, a name reference for de Vere. Now we're looking at verse 17. After the number 17, count 4 words, and there's the word cross. A cross is a tau or T, so we have 1740. Same verse, the word below the number 17 is fourth, F-O-O-R-T-H. In classical Greek, H or eta represents the long vowel E, so here fourth can be spelled F-O-O-R-T-E, 4T. With the number 17 above it, again we have 1740. The third reference is found by counting up all the words that complete what started in verse 17, continuing with the call-on into verse 18. Remember, the word cross is used as a letter or a symbol for tau, so it's not a word. If we then count all the words following verse number 17, there's 40. So for a third time in verse 17 is a reference to de Vere's number 1740. I believe this way of counting the words is valid because if we count cross as a letter or symbol and not as a word, Golgotha becomes the 22nd word. Again, in Hebrew, tav or tau is the 22nd or final letter, and it's on Golgotha where the crucifixion takes place. On the next page in chapter 19, the number for verse 34 is on the 40th line. 34 is 17 times 2. With the repeated count, 34 is equal to 2 letter L's. I explained this in my 9th video, but I'll go over it again. In John Dee's Modus Hieroglyphica, the letter L can be manipulated to make a letter V. 2 L's then can make 2 V's. Again, 2 L's equal 34. If 34 is read from right to left, 43 is equal to 2 V's. 2 V's is for de Vere. 34 can be read as 3 times 4 equaling 12. There's 12 letters in Edward de Vere and Earl of Oxford. Also, 1 plus 7 plus 4 plus 0 equals 12. Looking closer at verse 34, it begins on line 40. Just below the number 34 is the word spear. After spear, there's 17 letters, followed by the word fourth. Again, an H can be read as an E, so we have spear 1740. Notice before the word spear is the letter A. If we count the letters before it, there's 24. Again, there's 12 letters in Edward de Vere and Earl of Oxford for 24 total. At the end of the Acts of the Apostles, there's the same headpiece that appears, I think, 3 times in the first folio. Alexander Waz pointed out that the plants are columbines and the animals are Cayley greyhounds, which appear on de Vere coat of arms. With everything I've shown in the past 2 videos, I think there's some evidence that someone knew Edward de Vere was Shakespeare. Now I want to go over one more thing. Returning to Job chapter 42, next to verse 17, where the book and chapter ends, is a dot or point just below the words "a burnt offering" in verse 8. The thing is, the online facsimile where I got this scan from was cleaned up, so I added the dot to reproduce what's printed on the facsimile I have. When I spoke to the place that I got this from, they assured me that nothing had been altered, that everything printed on their original 1611 Bibles appears on the facsimile, so that dot is meant to be there. I apologize for the blur, but the book's pretty massive and didn't fit well on the scanner. You can see, though, that on a wider page the dot stands out, and when you're looking at the book it really draws your attention. Remember, this dot appears in Job 42 on the same page with de Vere references, following 2 previous chapters, 40 and 41, with other de Vere references. Now, before I'm dismissed with "you're crazy, it's just a dot," I'm going to take you back to my first video. In Modus Hieroglyphica, John Dee gives the printer instructions to carefully copy everything he sees, including points or dots. These same instructions reflect what we find in the Sonnets and are used to encode messages about light and Jesus, as well as the names for the Rosy Cross and Edward de Vere's FORTIS. I've only made a cursory search through the Bible, but I did look closely at all the end pages like this one, and didn't find any other marks or points like this. Now, if this dot was under some meaningless word or phrase, I could see disregarding it, but it's not. It's under the words "a burnt offering," and this, as it turns out, is pretty significant. I did some research and found this article from the Oxfordian written by Connie Bean. A A burnt offering is a reference to the biblical character Jephthah alluded to in Hamlet. It's said that Hamlet's the most autobiographical of the de Vere Shakespeare plays, and that the character Polonius is based on Oxford's father-in-law, Lord Burleigh. In the play, Hamlet calls Polonius Jephthah, but why does he do this, and what does it have to do with Edward de Vere and a black dot in the King James Bible? First, I'm going to quote the article. Scholars have long recognized that Jephthah is a reference to a story found in the 11th and 12th chapters of the biblical book of Judges. Hamlet's remarks allude specifically to the last 10 lines of chapter 11, which detail how Jephthah, going into battle against the Ammonites on behalf of Israel, makes a solemn vow to God that if he returns victorious, that thing that cometh out of the doors of my house to meet me shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it for a burnt offering. Tragically, the first thing to come out of Jephthah's house is his only child and daughter, who he sacrifices in obedience to his vow. Again, the reference to Jephthah alludes to the last verses of Judges chapter 11. I was surprised when I saw chapter 11 has 40 verses. What I have highlighted here is Jephthah's vow. For I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back, followed by his daughter's response to do what he promised God. Interestingly, 17 lines later is verse 40. Now, from what I've read in the article and on the De Vere Society webpage, the Jephthah reference has to do with Lord Burleigh's active campaigning in 1584 for what was known as the Bond of Association, also known as the Assassin's Charter. After plots against Queen Elizabeth failed to depose her, this document, this Bond of Association, was a key legal precedent for the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots. How this relates to Burleigh and the character Jephthah, again I quote from Connie Bean's article. Burleigh, as one of the primary architects of the 1584 Bond of Association and probably one of its first signatories, can be seen as a contemporary Jephthah, a man who swore a solemn conditional oath to God, the fulfillment of which obligated him to commit an unlawful act, murder, against a person or persons yet unnamed. Not only did Burleigh swear to the oath himself, but he used this considerable influence to have other members of the Privy Council and dozens, if not hundreds, of others around England to do likewise. And how this pertains to Edward de Vere. As one of the highest-ranking members of the Elizabethan peerage, Edward de Vere was at the epicenter of the events of 1584 to 1587 surrounding the Bond of Association. As the Earl of Oxford, he would have been under pressure to sign the bond. As Burleigh's son-in-law, he would have been under even greater pressure. There is no definitive record whether or not he signed, but it seems likely that he would have. If we consider that Polonius is in part a reflection of Lord Burleigh, then Hamlet's fleeting mention of the biblical Jephthah becomes far more than a simple reference to a man with a daughter whom he sacrificed to his own ambitions, and becomes an oblique commentary on one of the most dangerous political issues of the time, the execution of an anointed queen. The dot isn't under insignificant words, it's under a specific phrase alluded to in Hamlet, the most autobiographical of the de Vere Shakespeare plays, referencing a real event in Oxford's life. I'm going to conclude by saying that whether or not Oxford signed the charter, and maybe he did and felt guilty for having done so, I believe this mark under a burnt offering could be a reference to Jephthah and Lord Burleigh, symbolizing a stain, the sin of participating in the murder of Mary, Queen of Scots. Someone knew how Oxford felt about the matter and encoded it and the fact that he was Shakespeare in the pages of the King James Bible. Keep in mind that the dot's in the book of Job, which is about divine retribution, meaning that whoever put it there believes a good person will receive blessings and an evil person will get what's coming to them.